As soon as Wendy mentioned that a huge group of refugees from the Eastern Territory would be arriving, the entire room was then filled with chatters. Wendy then explained the shipping department was going all out to bring them over. And right now, the entire lake was packed with boats, all loaded with food and winter clothing, ready to bring them over. The witches then started asking about their hometowns. Some asked about the situation in Golden Sickle City. Some of them secretly hoped that people from their hometown might be among the refugees. However, one of the younger witches suddenly remembered how her father had kicked her out of the house when he found out she was a witch. Now, she wasn't so sure she wanted to run into anyone from home after all. Another witch tried to comfort her, saying that it was all because of the church's nonsense and they probably regretted it by now. Wendy tells everyone there were about 12,000 people on their way. She explained that these folks were coming from everywhere, from Golden Sickle City to Sewin County, so it'd be almost impossible not to run into someone back home. Once Scroll finished up the headcount, they could start matching people up by their backgrounds. But Wendy also reminded them not to stress out, since this was just the first wave and more people would be arriving in Neverwinter soon enough. She believed that if they stay here long enough they will run into a familiar face. Wendy then looks at the younger witch and tells her that even if she doesn't want to reconnect with family, at least hearing some news is better than nothing. Perhaps her family might regret what they had done and want to make amends. Hearing this, the younger witch named White Pear nodded quietly. That's when Akima piped up asking if they were planning to move the whole Eastern Territory to Neverwinter. Wendy smiled and explained, it's not just the Eastern Territory. The North, the South, and even the central parts of the kingdom are part of the relocation plan. Eventually, only a few big cities will remain, and everyone from the smaller towns and villages will be gathered in them. Akima, clearly confused, wanted to know why the king would go through all this trouble. Wendy shrugged, not entirely sure how to explain it either. She remembered Roland called it something like urbanization, quite a fancy word. Basically, things used to be super spread out because everyone needed a ton of farmland just to feed one city. Now, food isn't such a big issue anymore, and all those villages are tough to manage. So, they figured it's better to have people move to the cities, which is better for city growth and all that. Wendy then turned to Akima and asked her if she had ever wondered what would happen to her sisters if she had just decided to leave right now. Akima frowned, not answering right away. Wendy pressed on, asking her if she really wanted her sisters to abandon their loved ones and wander around their likely empty and rundown hometowns. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension, saying all of this is an act of weakness. Everyone whipped their heads around to see Nightingale emerging from the mist, casually sitting on the table. Akima, slightly taken aback, asked, "Who is she?" Wendy jumped in, equally surprised but quickly explaining that Nightingale meant no harm, she was just the witch secretly assigned to protect her. Nightingale, with a smirk, asked the group if they thought she was wrong. She believed the only reason they were hesitating was because of Bloodfang, and that deep down, they didn't really want to serve Princess Tilly anymore. She pointed right at Akima and said that all of them still rely on that sleeping spell to get by, so in the end, nothing really changed. Akima shot back, saying that was nonsense. Her excuse was if it wasn't for Doris, they would have left ages ago. She was quick to challenge Nightingale, asking what she even knew about the whole Bloodfang and Slumbering Isle issue. Nightingale didn't bother answering directly. Instead, she threw out a question, asking them why weren't they working. The question caught Akima off guard. Nightingale raised two fingers and started breaking it down for them, step by step, while doing some quick math for them. For example, the travel costs and food expenses for getting from Neverwinter to the Eastern Territory. Then add the daily expenses once they get there. She also mentioned that most of those places have turned into wastelands thanks to war and migration. So, if they wanted to buy supplies out there, it would cost them 10 times more than normal. That's why so many refugees were heading to Neverwinter in the first place. Jumping off the table, she walked slowly toward Akima and added that none of them had a single gold coin in their pockets, so leaving wasn't as easy as they thought. If she were in their shoes, she'd seize this opportunity in Neverwinter, apply for a job, and use it as a stepping stone to make their group self-sufficient. She didn't just stop there. She pointed out that for the last 2 weeks, they'd been enjoying food and supplies offered to them for free, and if they were still waiting for Princess Tilly to send them travel money too? Akima still tried to argue, but Nightingale cut her off. She didn't want to hear any excuses, and this is why she called it weakness. She believed initially they all turned to Bloodfang because of the church, which is understandable, but when the whole mess happened between Bloodfang and Tilly's faction, they still had many options, yet they did nothing. Nightingale may not have known all the details about Bloodfang and Slumbering Isle, but she is certain of one thing, which is that all of the Bloodfang members were in Neverwinter now. If they wanted to know what happened, they could go ask any time. She asked her if she honestly thought Heidi considered them as her sisters. Wendy rushed over, trying to calm things down, telling Nightingale to stop, but Nightingale wasn't finished. She went on, revealing Heidi's true intentions. Heidi doesn't see any of them as a sister, rather she sees them as a tool. If she really trusted or cared about them, why didn't she tell them about the plan to overthrow Tilly back on Slumbering Isle? Akima was speechless. Nightingale then pressed on, telling her that if she wanted to prove her determination, she better start with the basics. She can make up excuses when they are back on some deserted island all she wants, but here in Neverwinter, neither Tilly nor the sleeping spell won't hold them back anymore. Nightingale glanced at Wendy one last time, then disappeared back into the mist. Wendy sighed and turned to the others, explaining that Nightingale is just a very straightforward person, but she doesn't mean any harm, so they shouldn't take her words too personally. But the witches were already looking down, feeling quite embarrassed. They knew that without the sleeping spell, things could get really tough for them. Akima, lost in thought, remembered the old days back when she had to use her abilities just to find loose coins on the streets, scraping together enough for a single loaf of bread to share with her sisters. They huddled together in a leaky shack, with no clothes, just trying to survive. Some of them didn't make it through those hard times, at least not until they met Bloodfawn. Akima clenched her fists, realizing that Nightingale had a point. Ever since Bloodfawn came into the picture, her group had gradually lost its independence. After all, why bother scrounging for a few coins when the combat witches had quicker, more profitable ways of earning? Suddenly, she turned to Wendy and asked, if they decided to leave Sleeping Spell, just how hard would things get for them? Wendy wasn't sure of the exact details. She admitted she didn't know how much the Sleeping Spell was planning to give out to the witches, but she was pretty confident it wouldn't be less than what the Witch Union offered. So probably no less than 1 gold coin a month, maybe more, but still, that's about 4 or 5 times what the average worker earns. Plus they get food and a place to live. Even if they left the sleeping spell, the Witch Union couldn't take them in right away. Wendy explained it was because His Majesty didn't want to create any tension between the two groups, which could easily lead to misunderstandings. But Akima didn't seem to care. She scoffed and did some quick math. Although they will no longer get paid by the sleeping spell, they can still find a job working for 20 silvers a month. With the 6 of them, that's 120 silvers altogether. She believed Nightingale really underestimated her. Akima isn't some pampered noble girl. She has dug through sewers and trash heaps just to find food, so she's not scared of a little hardship. She says it loudly for everyone to hear, although not even sure if Nightingale is still in the room, but she still challenges Nightingale and tells her to just watch. Wendy opened her mouth to offer more advice, but Doris gently stopped her. Doris knew Wendy meant well, and after everything Nightingale had said, Doris felt a bit ashamed of their past actions too. Maybe Nightingale was right, perhaps Heidi never truly cared about them. Still, Doris supported Akima's decision no matter what. So did all of them. Akima turned to face the group. She's decided that she would be leaving the sleeping spell, and she would repay everything they owed to them. And she promises that she will prove Nightingale wrong. Since Akima was so determined, Wendy agreed to explain the situation to Tilly. At the same time, she'd ask Roland to allow them to keep their special wages. That way, when they joined the Witch Union later on, they could also earn some allowances to make things a bit easier. Akima turns around and tells Wendy to do whatever she wants to do. She doesn't care. After leaving the building, Wendy let out a long sigh. Nightingale, sensing something was off, asked what was bothering her. Wendy confessed that she suddenly felt a bit guilty. She's not exactly the person they think she is. Her goal coming in today was getting them to work for Roland. Nightingale walked up to her, offering a reassuring smile, saying Wendy's doing what's best for everyone. If she left them in their current state, their rebellious attitudes would eventually cause problems for Princess Tilly too. Clearly, that wouldn't help anyone. Nightingale had seen plenty of people like Akima, and she believes that sometimes tough love works better than soft words. Wendy felt a little better, and she believed asking for Nightingale's help was the right call. She managed to shut down someone like Akima, who doesn't even hold back in front of Tilly. No wonder they used to call her the shadow assassin of the capital. Nightingale replied it was all Wendy's plan and she's just delivered it with a bit more edge. Wendy shook her head, believing the little bit of edge was everything. Even she got scared for a moment since it didn't look like Nightingale was acting. Nightingale wasn't sure if Wendy was complimenting her or teasing, but Wendy just turned around with a grin, saying she really meant it and she will offer chaos drinks as proof. The next morning, after reading through Wendy's report, Roland finally felt relieved. Just as he set the report down, the phone rang. A voice on the other end informed him that the Fjord Explorer, Sandbirdman, and his fleet had arrived at the port. Roland quickly made his way to the port, flanked by a few guards. Waiting for him was Margaret, someone he hadn't seen in a while, and next to her was the Fjord Explorer, Sandbirdman. But Roland had to do a double take when he saw Sand's outfit. The guy was covered head to toe in feathers, looking more like a walking bird than an explorer. Looking at Sandbirdman, or perhaps we better call him Thunder, had completely misunderstood the assignment and took Roland's words way too literally. While he knew Thunder didn't want Lightning to recognize him, there was no way this over-the-top disguise would go unnoticed. With both Lightning and Maisie always keeping an eye on things, even with a fake mustache slapped on, Maisie would totally see through it. But Thunder seemed pretty pleased with himself. He was even a bit smug about his getup, saying how this look even becomes quite the trend across several islands, ever since he had it custom made. Roland couldn't help but wonder if it was because everyone in the fjord looked up to Thunder. Either way, it's nice to see Thunder, who's almost 40 but still kept this youthful energy, since Roland is sure no one else would bother going to such lengths for a made-up name. However, Thunder was surprised to hear the steamship was completely built. He knew in the fjord, even with the best craftsmen and materials, it would take years. Roland, however, thought it took long enough, since steel is a lot easier to work with than wood, so they didn't need to soak it to prevent rot or wait for it to dry and set. Just get the heat right, and they are good to go. He then invited Thunder to have a look. Hearing that, Thunder's eyes lit up with excitement. But then Roland glanced at the huge crate of gold coins. He asked what was with all the gold, since he was pretty sure they made an agreement where he would only charge Thunder the cost price for the ship. Margaret chuckled and explained, of course, they wouldn't dare refuse Roland's generosity. But this isn't for the ship, it's from the sales of perfume and chaos drinks. Roland stared in amazement. He believed the deadline for the delivery wasn't even close yet. Margaret smiled and added that they were passing through anyway, they thought they'd lighten the load for next time. Roland's two products were a massive hit in the fjord, especially the chaos drinks. The premium ones could be flipped for 10 times their original price after just a few trades, and even the lower quality versions had collectors eager to snatch them up. Chaos drinks had basically become a status symbol at all the major merchants' banquets. Hearing this, Roland knew letting professional merchants handle the business was definitely the right call. Just then, Nightingale whispered something in Roland's ear, snapping him out of his thoughts. He was told there was a witch in the crew. Looking more closely, he spotted her hiding behind two maids. When the girl saw Roland looking at her, she quickly ducked behind the maids, meanwhile sneaking glances at him. Roland remembered Margaret mentioning this was her childhood friend. Sure enough, Margaret introduced the girl as Joan. What caught Roland's attention, though, was that Joan had legs now and was able to come on land. He recalled Margaret once saying that Joan had chosen to live in the sea and hadn't interacted with humans for a long time. Margaret explained that this change was thanks to Tilly and Camilla. Without the ability to communicate directly through consciousness, Joan might still be struggling to adapt to life among humans. But there was still a big hurdle because Joan had forgotten how to speak. Thunder had brought in all sorts of scholars to help, but so far, Joan could only manage a few words, unable to hold a proper conversation. Margaret paused for a moment, and Roland, curious, asked what was on her mind. She hesitated before admitting, saying she was not sure if it was because Joan spent so long in her transformed state, but some parts of Joan's body weren't quite human anymore. She then continued explaining that normally, witches look just like anyone else when they're not using magic. But Joan, well, she can't fully return to her original form. For instance, she still has some scales on her body. Roland's mind immediately flashed images of Lorca's fluffy ears. He thought, scales are pretty cool too. But he quickly shook off the dirty thoughts. Now wasn't the time to be daydreaming. He remembered how Lorca's ears even made her own people uneasy, and he worried that Joan's situation might be even worse. After a moment of consideration, he asked Margaret if he could get a closer look at Joan. Margaret nodded, and as Roland slowly approached Joan, she looked a bit frightened, hiding further behind the maids. Roland looked concerned and asked Margaret has someone had been harassing Joan. Margaret let out a sigh and explained although they tried their best to prevent it, word still got out, and some people are just way too cruel. Thunder then explained to help Joan readjust to human life, they couldn't avoid her interacting with others. But unfortunately, very few in the fjord can accept her appearance. Some maids and scholars even ran off in fear, and even rumors started spreading that he was keeping a sea demon at home. Thunder shook his head, clearly frustrated, and he believed if this keeps up, maybe the sea is a better place for her after all. But Margaret didn't agree. From what she's seen, Joan doesn't seem to dislike these changes. Sure, she still needs to spend time in the sea every week, but she really enjoys hanging out with the maids who accept her. And she's even developed a taste for cooked food, no longer eating raw seafood. As they spoke, Joan peeked out from behind the maids, only to quickly hide again. Margaret apologized to Roland, saying Joan is just not used to so many people yet. Nightingale couldn't help but tease, saying it was Roland that scared her. However, he just shrugged it off, deciding not to push Joan further. He believed there's plenty of time, and she'll get used to things eventually. With that, he motioned for Thunder to follow him to the docks for a tour. As they arrived, the shipyard was a fortress in itself, surrounded by tall walls, watchtowers, and First Army soldiers keeping guard. When Margaret laid eyes on the massive iron ship, she was speechless, almost thinking she was dreaming. Even Thunder, who had seen all kinds of ships, was buzzing with excitement, even saying the biggest three-mast ship wouldn't stand a chance against this beast. Heck, he bet even a deep-sea monster would turn tail and flee if it saw this thing. The sailors who came with Thunder were equally thrilled. Thunder couldn't help but marvel, although he knew Neverwinter's shipbuilding was impressive, this was something else. Just the fact that they managed to piece together such hard steel and all the materials they used was far beyond anything the fjords could ever manage. Realizing just how costly this ship must have been to build, Thunder glanced down at his coin pouch, already calculating how much this was going to set him back. Roland noticed the look on his face and chuckled, telling him they could talk about the price later. But he promises, it'll be a lot cheaper than he thinks. However, that's not really the point. Roland's tone grew more serious as he continued, just like he said before, exploring new seas is important for all of humanity. And as the king of Grey Castle, he's more than happy to contribute to that cause. Thunder was moved by Roland's vision. Very few people were willing to spend money on something that didn't offer immediate returns, even in the fjord, where merchant guilds only cared about new trade routes that promised profit. Thunder thought Roland's way of thinking surpassed that of most explorers. Hearing this, Roland thought to himself, it seemed that back when they first met, Thunder didn't fully believe in his words. But in terms of sheer curiosity about the world, Roland felt no one could match him, especially since the mysteries he sought to uncover might hold the key to the divine war and the secrets hidden behind it. Before long, Roland led them aboard for a full tour of the ship. By the end of the tour, he was in awe. This wasn't just a ship, it was like a floating fortress. Thunder thought Roland had overestimated his own expectations because this was beyond anything he could have imagined. With this ship, Thunder felt confident he could cross even the treacherous Maelstrom Sea. But Roland chuckled, telling him to not jump to conclusions just yet. He admitted that he knew next to nothing about shipbuilding. He tells him this is really just a complicated machine right now, not a true sea vessel. And they need to test it in the water to see how it performs, testing its speed, stability, crew capacity, and food storage, things he will likely need Thunder to provide input on. However, if everything goes well, he will be able to head to the Shadow Isle after the month of the demon ends. Thunder was shocked by his words. Didn't Roland just say he didn't know anything about shipbuilding? He let out a laugh, saying if those old shipwrights heard Roland, they'd probably throw themselves into the sea out of shame. But deep down, he believed Roland. If Roland managed to craft such a beast without having much knowledge, then what about the stuff he actually knows? Roland gave him a sly grin and tells him that he would find out the answer to that question tomorrow. But first, they should enjoy tonight's banquet. And while they are at it, he will introduce him to the person he's been dying to meet. As evening fell, the castle came alive with music and laughter. The banquet tables were overflowing with food and drink, and Roland was still deep in conversation with Thunder. Off to the side, Lorca, Maisie, and Lightning were enjoying the feast. Lorca nudged Lightning, pointing to the man talking to Roland. She heard that guy's an explorer from Lightning's hometown, asking if she's curious to talk to him. Lightning, chewing on a piece of food, shrugged, recalling the man's name was Sandbirdman or something, but she'd never heard of him before, so probably not a very important person. She nonchalantly passed a mushroom up to Maisie, who was perched on her head. She tells them the fjord has tons of explorers, but most of them are just guys who've sailed a few routes and never even seen a hurricane. What she's more curious about is why Rem hasn't shown up yet. Lorca, wagging her tail with curiosity, watched the man closely. She believed the guy must have been quite important if her great chieftain was personally talking to him. She insisted that the man might have some news about her father. Maisie agreed, flapping her wings in support. Lightning let out a sigh, but since her friends were so interested, she decided to go say hello. After all, they were just looking out for her. As she slowly made her way toward the two of them, she watched Sandbirdman's exaggerated gestures and thought the guy was too flashy, and his clothes are rather quite ridiculous. In her mind, this guy is nothing like her father's calm, commanding, and respectful nature. Just as Lightning was about to approach, Margaret appeared, smiling warmly, and tells her it was perfect timing. She then pulled Lightning forward, introducing the man, saying his name is Sandbirdman, an explorer from Twin Dragon Island, and also the head of his local merchants guild, who happens to be a huge fan of her father. Lightning gave him a polite smile as they made eye contact. Thunder, ever the showman, played along and asked if she was Lord Thunder's daughter. Tells her that Margaret has told him so much about her and how Lightning really does look like her father. Lightning smiled, but inwardly her impression of him dropped even more. Her father had always told her she looked more like her mother, who she never had the chance to meet. Lightning remained polite and asked him if he had any recent news about her father. Thunder, still sticking to his third-person storytelling mode, recounted some of his recent adventures. He even warned Lightning not to believe any malicious rumors she might hear about her father. As they chatted, Lightning's impression of him improved slightly and believed the man wasn't so bad after all. At least now he seemed more tolerable. Curious, she asked if he discovered any new islands on his journey. Thunder paused, glancing at Roland, who gave him a knowing smile. Thunder then replied, saying how he owed it all to her father. After they discovered the Shadow Isles, his crew set off to deliver supplies, but along the way, they ran into a sea monster. It knocked them off course, and that's when they stumbled upon an uncharted island. Roland couldn't help but admire Thunder's acting. He was spinning quite the tale, and somehow, Lightning didn't seem to suspect a thing. But from Lightning's point of view, she had pieced it together. This Sandbirdman guy was just one of those lucky explorers who happened to discover something by chance after a few voyages. So she smiled and said, "That's exactly the thrill of exploration, you never know what you'll find." With that, she excused herself, bowing to Roland before leaving. As she walked away, Thunder breathed a sigh of relief, feeling confident that his disguise had worked. He turned to Roland and said he was glad that he made the right choice. He will leave Lightning in Roland's care from here on out. Margaret, watching Lightning walk off, said out loud how she's really grown up. The way she spoke so seriously just now made her just want to scoop her up and smother her like when she was little. Roland smiled and nodded, telling Thunder she hadn't given up her adventurous spirit. Even here, she's already started her own exploration team. Sure, it's only 3 members right now, but he's certain one day she'll be following in Thunder's footsteps. Thunder let out a sigh, believing if it's truly unavoidable, then maybe it's just fate. But he'd rather his daughter never face those dangers. At least, until that day comes, he just wants her to stay happy and safe. The 3 of them turned to look at Lightning. She was chatting and laughing with her friends, completely at ease. Roland gave Thunder a reassuring pat on the shoulder while telling him to not worry, and promised to take care of Lightning. Back with her small crew, Lightning's friends were quick to ask if she heard anything about her dad. Lightning shrugged, saying just as she thought, there's nothing new. But she wasn't too bothered by it. Even reassured them with a grin since she believed these things are more fun when they handle them themselves. That's what their little exploration team is for. She looked around, though, noticing that Rem still hadn't shown up. Lightning felt a bit disappointed. After all, Rem had been so confident before, and now she doesn't even show up. Lorca, curious, asked, "What's this challenge she's planning anyway?" Maisie fluttered her wings while saying she had no idea. Lorca facepalmed in frustration, wondering to herself why she joined this team in the first place. But both Lightning and Maisie, with typical adventurous spirits, were ready for whatever challenge Rem threw their way. Just then, Rem arrived, apologizing for being late. The group turned to her, and Lightning teased, saying she thought Rem chickened out. Rem puffed up proudly and explained that she was just investigating some things to make sure the challenge went smoothly. With a dramatic flair, she explained the rules of the challenge, but before they get into that, she's going to introduce her team. And then she announced, from today, the Neverwinter Detective Agency is officially formed. She said this with such enthusiasm, but Lily immediately protested, saying she was not part of this. Meanwhile, the 3 of them had no idea what a detective agency was. Rem blushed and quickly added, "It's the name that His Majesty gave them." She heard about it from Sister Wendy after they helped investigate that arson case in the Academy District. Apparently, Roland liked what they did and came up with the name. Lightning raised an eyebrow, feeling a bit skeptical, and said it sounds fishy. Rem shot back telling her to ask Sister Wendy if she doesn't believe it. Sharon, one of Rem's new recruits, seemed thrilled. Believed if they could help improve the safety of Neverwinter, she's willing to join the detective agency. For anyone who didn't remember Sharon, she was the girl who stood up to some bullies at school, protecting her classmates. It was at that moment she unexpectedly awakened as a witch, and her ability accidentally started a fire. Anyway, Summer also volunteered. After all, she was already part of the security bureau. Rem gave them both a big thumbs up. She knew Lightning often had scouting missions for the First Army, so as long as they prioritized the King's orders, there wouldn't be any issues with the challenge. Lily, however, raised her hand in protest. She tells them that she already has way too much going on in the lab, and she has to double the mushroom farming operations, so she doesn't have time for these games. No amount of persuasion could convince Lily. Rem huffed, calling her a traitor. Lily, irritated, was about to storm off, but Rem quickly hugged her to stop her. She pleaded for her to hear her out first. She tells everyone that everyone knew His Majesty had recently welcomed a group of guests from the fjord, and tonight's banquet was held in their honor. Among them, there was a witch. Rem explained that she had been down at the port doing a light inspection, but Lily interrupted, rolling her eyes. Wondering who checks lights during the day, pointing out Rem was clearly just wandering around. Ignoring her, Rem continued her story. She had spotted the witch among the group from the fjord. Apparently, they would be staying in Neverwinter for a few months, and that is where the challenge comes in. Turned out, the challenge this time is to see who can recruit the new witch into their team first. She pointed out that her detective squad now had 4 members, making it the largest group in the Witch Union. But since Lightning's group was formed earlier, she considered them tied in strength. This competition would settle who had the strongest group once and for all. Lorca, munching on some food while listening, finally chimed in. She then asked, "So the whole challenge is about recruiting a witch?" Which seemed kinda random to her. But Lightning and Maisie were already fired up, taking the contest very seriously. Lorca sighed, thinking to herself once again, is it too late to back out now? Even though Lightning's team was outnumbered, she didn't see it as a problem. With a confident smile, she looked at Rem and said, "Challenge accepted." Rem quickly warned the others not to think this challenge would be easy. She explained that Joan couldn't really speak and was very cautious around strangers. She explained it's kind of like how they were when the church was hunting them down, so she believed it was going to be a long game. Both teams agreed to the challenge with a handshake. That's when Lorca walked over and interrupted, asking a very practical question. Even if she stays for a while, Joan will eventually leave. So, what's the point of recruiting her if she's just going to move on? But Rem had a different view. She recalled how Roland had helped her out of her own dark place. So she believed if they could help Joan become more open and cheerful, then what they were doing wouldn't be meaningless. Meanwhile, her gaze drifted toward Roland. She believed to ordinary people, it might not seem like much, but for someone like Joan, it could be like a light shining into her darkness. Rem smiled softly and tells Lorca that's what His Majesty has been doing from the very beginning. Lorca couldn't help but smile back. Maybe this group wasn't as immature as she thought. Suddenly, Lily raised an eyebrow and asked, "How did Rem know all this about Joan?" Rem froze for a moment. Then it hit Lily, Rem must have used Summer's abilities to eavesdrop on Roland's conversation. Lily was fuming. Rem hurried to defend herself, saying she was just replaying the scene at the harbor. His Majesty said everything in front of everyone and it wasn't a secret. Lily wasn't having it. Since this was clearly crossing the line, she even planned to go and tell Wendy. Rem panicked, trying to plead her case, but Lily just pinched her cheeks. Rem quickly promised, saying it won't happen again. Just then, Maisie suddenly soared into the air. No one paid her attention as she flew across the banquet hall, grabbing a piece of roasted meat right in front of the surprised Sylvie. Carrying the meat, she headed straight for Joan. Joan and the maids around her were startled, but when she saw Maisie, Joan didn't seem to mind at all. In fact, she greeted Maisie with a friendly smile. The two then started talking to each other, Joan with soft grunts and Maisie with her usual bird-like cools, which caused Lorca to watch in bewilderment since the conversation was utterly incomprehensible. After a while, Maisie fluttered back to Lightning's shoulder, proudly announcing that Joan had agreed to join their exploration team. Everyone turned to see Joan, accompanied by her maids, slowly making her way toward Lightning. Even Margaret and Roland noticed them. Meanwhile, Maisie was flying back and forth between the two, as if she were relaying some important messages. To everyone's surprise, Joan allowed Lightning to hold onto her hands. Roland quickly realized what had just happened. Margaret, on the other hand, was completely stunned. She tells Roland this is unbelievable because it took them 2 months just to get her out of the water, and that was with Camilla's help. Thunder was equally curious. How did Lightning manage to do it so quickly? Roland took a sip of his drink and tells them Lightning didn't need to do anything special, just having Maisie and Lorca around did the trick. He explained that Joan's distrust stemmed from how people treated her as an outsider. But when she's surrounded by others who are considered different too, like Maisie and Lorca for example, that barrier naturally comes down. In Joan's eyes, they are just like her. Margaret still seemed a bit puzzled, so Roland elaborated, Margaret is already familiar with Maisie, but this is her first time seeing Lorca, but Lorca is very similar to Joan. As they watched the group interact, Joan seemed completely at ease, even picking up Lorca's tail with a sense of curiosity. Roland smiled, seemed like Joan is fitting in perfectly.